Good. Why don't we get started? So this is the Funders as Publishers session, and I'm Tom Beyer. I'm the Director of Platform Services at Sheridan Pub Factory, and we've got a great lineup of speakers today to really cover this topic from a variety of points of view. First up will be Dr. Paul Aris, who's the Pro-Vice Provost of UCL Library Services, and he'll sort of be representing a sort of non-traditional publishing perspective. And then after him will be Will Schweitzer, Director of Product and Custom Publishing for AAAS and the Science Family of Journals. And Will sort of comes at it from more of a traditional society publisher point of view. And following that will be Sabrina Alam, who's the editorial director from F1000, representing both another sort of non-traditional publisher, but also sort of a platform enabler for funders. And finally, Marianne Martone, PhD and professor, researcher, and editor-in-chief at Brain and Behavior at Wiley. So this is a pretty interesting and broad topic. Hopefully we'll cover the sort of, these sort of broad questions that you saw in the program. Each speaker is going to come at this, somewhat from their own point of view, of course. And just logistically, we're going to have short talks from each of them, and then quite an extensive period for Q&A afterwards. So I really hope everybody really engages, because I think that we're really looking forward to sort of a lively discussion here. And finally, we are being live streamed, so during the Q&A, please do, we want your questions, but please do speak into a microphone, and we'll be running them around, because we've got people virtually listening in, and that's the only way they can hear you. So, and with that, I think we will kick off with Dr. Paul Aris.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for the opportunity to come and talk. Sorry about the slight technical hitch. We lost the PowerPoint, but now we found it. So I'm going to talk for 10 minutes about funders and universities as publishers. Although the theme of the session is about funders as publishers, I'm really from a university. I'm Pro-Vice Provost in UCL, University College London, and we are a publisher because we have our own press. These are the questions that I was asked to consider, and I'm going to look at them in a little bit of detail, one after the other. What do researchers, authors and readers, want in an open access model? How has your organisation reacted to the challenges? What are the perceived challenges in moving from a commercial business model or commercial models to transitioning to full open access? And what does the future of scholarly publishing look like in an open access world? So the views I'm going to present now are my own, but they are largely European views based on the work I do in Europe with LERU, the League of European Research Universities, which are 23 research-intensive universities across the continent of Europe. And my feeling is that our priorities and our emphases are different from the ones I'm hearing this week in Chicago from North America. So what do researchers, both authors and readers, want from OA? Well, they want impact and visibility for their research, and they want to be recognised for producing it. And a particularly European emphasis, they want to make a contribution to parts of society not normally engaged in scholarly outputs, because in Europe, certainly in Western Europe, there is a very strong dialogue between government and universities about the role of universities and the relevance of universities to society, and therefore the ability of universities to get state funding from the national government to fund university activities. And one of the ways of guaranteeing or securing that funding is to show the contribution that you make to society to non-traditional audiences. So in Europe, that is a big issue. And for research, if you're a researcher or an author, you want a workflow and a model which is easy to understand. And again, in Europe, this is where the library comes in, because it's the library that normally takes over administration for all the OA activity to pay for article processing charges. Most of these charges are met by funder grants from our research funders, but they're managed not by the individual researcher, but by the library. They're centralised through the university administration and all given to the library to manage on behalf of the university. So the library has a really big role to play in transitioning the university from a traditional business model to an OA model. How has your organisation reacted to these changes? Well, as I say, the library manages the central open access budget, and that would be typical across Europe. And in my institution, Research Intensive University, we paid 11,000 APCs since we started recording our activity in 2013. And that's the team of open access administrators that I've created in the library to manage the open access transition across the university. The library ensures that we comply with REF, our Research Excellence Framework, which is a national research evaluation exercise undertaken every 7 years by Research England now, formerly by HEFCE, our Higher Education Funding Council, and that does dictate how millions of pounds come into the university for research support. And for the next REF in 2021, we're all working on building the submission for REF 2021 at the moment. There is an open access requirement. Every output that a researcher submits to the research evaluation framework has to have an open access component, usually stored in the institutional repository. And if it doesn't, it won't be eligible for REF evaluation. And your university risks losing significant sums of money in funding as a result of not being compliant for OA. So that is a game changer as far as the UK is concerned, because it is changing the culture at academic level because of the need to comply to get funding. The library runs Discovery, which is our second most downloaded institutional repository in the UK. And we've established the first fully open access university press in the UK. So I am not only university librarian, but also chief executive of UCL Press. There are a number of benefits to starting an open access press, and I've tried to list them here in a graphical format. I started the press. It was my idea. We started 3 years ago in 2015. Which of these were the most important things that I took into account? Well, I think middle row, top box, is the one that I would cite as the single most important reason for founding the press. It was going to be a challenge to the prevailing scholarly publishing model, to think of new ways of doing things, to innovate, and to be successful as a result of that innovation. Because in many subject areas, particularly in arts, humanities and social sciences, there is the challenge that research monographs don't sell in very large numbers and have low impact as a result. And open access publishing is a way of changing that. We've now been publishing for 3 years. We've published just under 80 research monographs, and we've just passed our first million download figure in April this year. And on current rate of performance, we'll be getting 1 million downloads every year, in excess of 1 million downloads every year. We're downloaded in 222 countries. There's only one country in the world where we're not downloaded, and I don't quite know why, but I need to organise a holiday in Papua New Guinea, because that's where we are not downloaded, and I need to get somebody to go and do a bit of downloading of UCL Press titles. All these are open access monographs. Our most downloaded book by Danny Miller, who's our professor of anthropology in the UCL Anthropology Department, is the result of a European Research Council grant. He's published a series of books. The first one was the kind of overall title, which sums up all the individual titles that are in the series. It was How the World Changed Social Media. And that's been downloaded 250,000 times in about 2 years. So my suggestion, one of the messages I bring here, is that open access publishing from an institutional open access publisher is transformative for arts, humanities and social sciences because it gives you the visibility and the impact which conventional publishing is failing to do. What are the perceived challenges in transitioning to open access? Nothing particularly European about these issues. I think we'd find the same issues in North America as well. Academic conservatism. Despite those fantastic download figures from our press, some arts, humanities and social science scholars feel that open access is still a matter for scientists, not for them. So they'll say, oh, well, you're really talking about science and engineering and biomedicine. You're not really talking to me. I'm a historian, even though many of our books are history books that we publish through the press. So there is a cultural issue there. Funding, the press has to be paid for. We're not for profit. I managed to persuade the university to divert a tiny percentage of the UCL research budget, some of that money that comes from the research evaluation framework, the REF exercise, for example, to fund the press. The total cost of the press is less than 0.1% of the total university research budget. And I think they get extra impact for spending that amount of money on the publishing activity. And that's the message that I sold to our provost, who's a great supporter of the press, particularly the 222 countries where we're being downloaded, because that supports his global engagement agenda for getting the university out there, recognised across the world as a leader in research and scholarship. And the press does that by the impact figures that it's able to provide. The final question I can't answer, and I hope we'll be closer to answering by the end of this session, will disruptive thinking change current publishing models? Will the kinds of things that we're doing in UCL make a difference? Let's wait and see. My last question is this: what is the future publishing model in an open access world? Well, now I point to back to LERU, the League of European Research Universities, whose views I'm sort of representing here today. LERU comprises 23 research-intensive universities across the continent of Europe, and we have just produced, I was the lead author of an open science roadmap for universities, which gives guidance. It's not a mandate because universities can choose to do what they like, but the roadmap gives advice on how universities can embrace open science, not just open access, but open science activities, if they wish to do that. And we make a number of recommendations. And we're just about to launch the paper in Brussels, in Belgium, on the 12th of June. New models of scholarly publishing is one of the 8 pillars of open science that we address in the roadmap. And our recommendation is that we do follow the open access press at an institutional level model that we've adopted in UCL, and that other universities in LERU, in the League, should do the same. And that LERU, as an alliance of 23 research-intensive universities, could set up their own open access publishing platforms, the LERU Open Access Publishing Platform, along the lines of the Wellcome Open Research Platform or the Bill and Melinda Gates platform, which is taking us beyond the concept of the individual journal title to a thematic or subject-based publishing platform run by a funder, if you're the Wellcome Trust, or by an institution, if you're one of these 23 universities in UCL. That's one of these 23 universities in LERU, and that's one of the recommendations in the roadmap that we will be investigating when we implement after the 12th of June. We provide a monitoring table for those 23 universities who want to monitor their progress in open science, and you can mark your progress regularly using the marking scheme and the traffic lights marking evaluation red, amber, green to show whether you're complying with open science requirements or not. So if you have been, thank you very much for listening, and there'll be plenty of time for questions at the end of the session.
So now we're going to hear from Will Schweitzer at AAAS.
Good morning. My name is Will Schweitzer. I'm the Director of Product and Custom Publishing for AAAS and the Science family of journals. We publish Science, Science Advances, a large-scale, all-open-access journal, and 4 additional specialty subscription titles. And it's important to know that I'm on the business side of the house. I have editorial colleagues here, and they may have completely different opinions about what I'm about to say. So I either hope they share those opinions during Q&A, or they're nice to me when I get back to DC next week. And it's important to note all of us on the panel are answering from a same set of 6 questions. So I'll answer some of the questions Paul did, and you'll kind of get a different perspective. But what I'm talking about today is funders as publishers and what that means for me, trying to understand our existing publishing business and how it may change. And then kind of broader, how I see open access affecting our subscription business kind of in the near term, the next 2 to 3 years. And when Welcome Open Research launched, I spent a lot of time scratching my head. I was trying to figure out what exactly it was. Was it more like a preprint server? Was it a data repository? Was it just another journal? And we figured it out. It constitutes formal publication, and it led us to begin to think about whether or not it was complementary or competitive. And it'll be great to hear from Sabina kind of in her talk later today. And what we heard, particularly in Europe and in the context of the open access discussions there, was that these new publication platforms could be better, faster, and cheaper. And as a traditional publisher, my reaction was, you can't do those 3 things at once, essentially, unless we're suckers, unless there's radical misalignments in our market. And I think that led me to question that what are kind of the short-term and long-term motivations for funders becoming publishers for this role shift? And what does that mean for the things that publishers have traditionally done? Does it duplicate kind of cost and effort within the system? And in a long-term way, will that effort, will that spend detract from something that's very dear to my organization, which is basic research funding? But I will say that funders as publishers gives us one more reason to innovate. And, you know, if you're a publisher at SSP, you've no doubt heard from 12 dozen vendors about new technologies or ways that we can automate our traditional processes, or ways that we can do things better or faster or provide more context or serve our authors and readers better. And I think these new platforms are giving us one more reason to think about things that are critical to authors, like publication speed, or how we can support data, or better present tables and figures, or address replicability challenges. It's the risk I get for putting animations in slides, is that I forget to click to show the animation. So the next question I wanted to answer were, what do researchers want? And this data is a preview of a survey AAAS and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation conducted last year. We invited 35,000 individuals to take the survey. We had a 1.6% response rate that was skewed towards North America. About 64% of respondents were from North America, 20% were from Europe, 9% were from Asia, 7% were from the rest of the world. And I think it says almost what every survey on what researchers or authors want, which is that they want to publish in a high-quality journal that is read by their peers. They want the journal to have a solid review process and short publication times. I think that we all know that to be true. And the other thing that we heard is, publishers, please make it easy for us to comply with open access requirements and their mandates. Essentially a report of our activities, our pilot program with Gates, including all the rest of the survey and the results, will be out before the end of this year. So what are the perceived benefits of open access? And this almost goes without saying, but our perspective is simple, that scientists and the public alike should have access to scientific finding. And it's long been our practice to make our research content free to read 12 months following publication. And we also allow authors to immediately deposit their accepted manuscript in their institutional repository or put it on their homepage. And we have a 6-month embargo for those accepted manuscripts going in wider subject repositories or appearing in PubMed. And for us, we view OA as being good business. And we're now finding that an increasing percentage of our market, let's call it roughly a quarter, and particularly in Europe, expects OA. And we're finding that more authors who entrust their work to our pages have a preference for OA. And then being business-minded and wearing the business hat, OA can be viewed as a revenue diversification strategy and as a way to improve and innovate. And those are all very good things. But just because there are good outcomes doesn't mean open access is easy. And my organization feels very strongly about this too, is that OA must benefit the science community, and it shouldn't come at the cost of research funding, or in my opinion, kind of reducing access to critical knowledge, particularly in the humanities and social sciences. And collectively, today, our open access dialogue seems much more informed and respectful than the conversation has been in the past, but it hasn't been productive. And we certainly need to hear more from authors and researchers, and that's why I'm really excited Marianne is on the panel today. I've been talking about OA for a while, and I think it's the first time I've been on a panel with an actual researcher. But I'd like to rant for just one moment, and it is that quality comes at a cost, and that cost is often much more than a $2,000 APC. And that when it is done right, things like prior to publication or traditional peer review can be invaluable, and that rigorous scholarship requires significant resource investments, iterative improvement, and applying rigorous standards. And a good professional editor can dramatically improve the accuracy, clarity, and readability and precision with which science is reported, and can reinforce processes that ensure ethical standards and that can improve replicability. And a lot of the problems that we are facing in our industry or within scholarly communications require kind of attentive stewardship, and that starts with peer review and expert editors for journals. And in terms of APCs and the services publishers can offer for that APC, the lowest common denominator leaves so much to be desired. And when someone tells me it shouldn't cost more than X amount of dollars to publish in Y journal, I think you're missing a lot of perspective. And a lot of that perspective is what that journal offers to an author. And from my perspective, and from being a nonprofit society publisher, there are valuable services that we provide that cost an awful lot to do. And I worry that if we have APC caps, if we have constraints on funding, if we kind of peg our anticipated spend to $2,000 or 2,000 euros, that we're going to lose things that are important to the scientific community and to the principal investigators who are our authors, who are our members, that we're all here to serve and support. And last, we absolutely haven't solved for non-APC supported publication types. We haven't solved for review journals, and they're developing solutions for things like monographs, but for science, our flagship publication, a good portion of what we publish are news and insights and perspectives, or they're careers resources. Those are valuable content sources that provide a service to the community that can't be APC supported. And if we want that content to be open, if we are saying it is important to all of us, we have to find some mechanism to support it. So what are the cost implications? And I'm going to offer a fun challenge to any publisher in the room, which is to go back to your office and try to identify all of your first or corresponding authors with a European institution. And you could start with something relatively small like Max Planck, or you could be a masochist and try to identify the first authors from any JISC institution. And by the time you've done that, you've probably pulled data from 4 different systems, all that have different data structures and terminologies, and you probably have no overarching layer where you can summarize all of that up to go from your submission system to an offsetting agreement that's likely in your institutional licensing system with spend, and fixing that in a way that can be automated and scalable, particularly if we see kind of the expansion of the author-to-reader agreements called for within Horizon 2020, is going to be a challenge, and it's going to take us years. And things like that, and particularly we've been watching the Horizon 2020 deals and the transition terms that are negotiated in the short term very carefully, is creating some governance challenges. So how do we balance investments and improvements in our systems and our publications and the things that we provide our authors and readers against an uncertain long-term revenue picture? So we know in the short term that we want to essentially take what are institutional licensing dollars and turn those into APC dollars. And that means pots of money are going to shift, and what have been relatively stable revenue streams for a publisher are going to become a little more variable and potentially more uncertain. And if you're a nonprofit, that can be really scary. And especially when you have enjoyed kind of stable revenues or stable income from your publications for a very long time. And while it is kind of early days, the other thing that I worry about is that these transition deals, at least in the short terms, aren't kind of introducing the free market reforms we expected, where authors could choose where to publish by a function of the services a journal could provide them and as a function of kind of that APC price. And while we recognize we're in a transition period, to me, what I'm seeing is that those APC dollars are being locked in with the existing commercial players almost following the same percentages of licensing spend. And I just want to go back to kind of market expectations and those APC caps, that small and nonprofit and society publishers may lack scale to achieve kind of that median market APC. And that if the expectation of the market is to hit a $2,000 APC, that's contingent on a lot of things, but some of it is having volume-based discounting or lower volume-based price from your production vendors, from your hosting platforms, a lot of things that make up kind of the constituent cost elements of that APC. And I think we have to think about what that means for our industry and kind of the sustainability for nonprofit and society publishers. There has to be improvements here. So what is my organization doing to address these challenges? Well, we launched Science Advances, our all open access, our large-scale journal in 2015. We are forming open access pilots with funders, libraries, and research institutions. We have a pilot with the Gates Foundation now. We are investing in our open access infrastructure. We're regularly engaging our stakeholders. And we're clarifying kind of our value proposition and what our society and our publications contribute back to the community. So what is the future of publishing in an open world? And to conclude my bit, I'll say that the future is very uncertain. And I'll share a bit of what the short-term and long-term horizon looks like from my perspective. Ann Michael and Dan Pollock at Delta Think had a really great observation that kind of open access seems to emanate east and west from Central Europe. And if they have a great resource, which is their OA News and Views newsletter, which I recommend everyone reads. But I think in the short term, we are very likely to find ourselves operating with two different business models in different geographic markets. In Europe, we are going to have essentially open access-based terms, which will require us to change our licenses and our systems. And in the rest of the world, we are going to continue to operate with institutional licenses as we always have. And that's going to create kind of a fragmented world for us. But one of the things I know for certain is in the open access market and in Europe, we're going to have to start to operate with a greater business-to-consumer focus, everything from our sales systems to our marketing approach to even changing who we are communicating with. And in the longer term, and I'm sorry to end with kind of a bleak bit, I think that this change to author-to-reader models and these open access pressures and depending on kind of the economic expectations and how these open access deals are negotiated, it may unfortunately lead to further consolidations of publishing houses, more society publishers joining commercial houses, and I think eventually it could potentially lead to journal cancellations. Small publishers are certainly going to be at risk with their scale disadvantages. So I am sorry to end there, but thank you.
And next up we have Sabrina Alam from F1000.
Thank you. Right, so it's a pleasure for me to be here. It's actually my first time at SSP, despite being in publishing for about 10 years. So in my previous life, I was a researcher. I was in neuroscience, and most of the journals that I would access were not open access. And actually, that's what drove my interest into why or how journals can actually sustain providing open access content. So about 10 years ago, I moved to Biomed Central. I stayed there for about 9 years, or just under 9 years, and then moved to F1000 Research last year in January, so looking at about 18 months. And I'm going to focus my talk on not on why open access. I think Paul and Will, lay that out really nicely, but on how F1000 in particular is trying to change the way that publishing is moving forward, not just in providing open access content, but in providing it in a very, very transparent way with regard to the peer review process and the data that underlines the findings that are presented in each paper. And the second half of my talk will focus on how we are actually working closely with funders and some institutions in providing similar publishing platforms of their own, using our model and actually our editorial office, but making it available to everyone that they fund. So what is F1000 Research? Well, we launched about 5 years ago, just over 5 years ago, as an open research publishing platform. The way that we're different is that we publish the content first. So it will undergo editorial checks, and then as long as all mandatory information has been provided, it's published. At that point, it's like a preprint, and the publication step triggers the peer review process. So the first point I have up there is author-focused. In the next couple of slides, I'll demonstrate as to why that is. But one of the main factors is that we want the authors to be part of the peer review process and the decision process in what the next step should be in their paper, i.e., should they revise, should they halt the peer review process, or so forth. So it's immediately published as long as all mandatory information has been provided, and the referee process is transparent. It's fully open. The referee reports are published alongside the articles as and when they come in. And because we publish the referee reports, we also want to provide the reviewers a measurable way of gaining credit for the work that they've put in to doing a review report. So the review report will actually have a DOI published on it independently of the article itself, so it becomes independently citable and shareable. And there's no editorial bias with regard to impact. So we're open to all sound science, all types of original research outputs. There's no one there making a decision on is this going to change the field or not. What we're looking at is this sensible? Can I follow what they've done? Can I repeat what they've done by looking at the data that they've shared? And as long as that's all fine and all ethics and consent have been met appropriately, then that's all we care about. As I said, the data sharing is made available, and the articles are living because they can be versioned. They can be revised and reviewed again and until is necessary, and that's in full view of everyone. And once it passes peer review, the articles are indexed in PubMed, Scopus, and other bibliographic databases. It's gold open access, so all the content, including the referee reports, are made available immediately upon publication. There's no embargo. And the article processing charges are kept deliberately low. So they're as low as $150 for a short article to $1,000 for a long article, which is classed as anything over 2,500 words. So I'm often asked, what's the difference between a journal and a platform? So with a journal, I would argue that you have your editorial checks, so you have the editor making a decision on if it's suitable or not, and deciding whether or not it should be peer-reviewed, and if so, if it's accepted, it will be published and indexed. In a platform, which is the F1000 research model, you have the same editorial checks. So you still have a staff editor going through it to check for things like, as I mentioned, ethics, consent, and data. And as long as that's fine, it's published as a version 1. Once version 1 is published, it's peer-reviewed, and then it can be revised or updated, peer-reviewed further if needed, and then indexed if it passes peer review. So the real difference is that all the steps that happen after editorial checks up until indexed is open, as opposed to being only for the eyes of the editorial office. So this is really the main difference. So in the title of my talk, I mentioned this is about not just transparency, but it's also about reducing research waste. So one of the key things this publishing model is trying to achieve is finding ways to encourage researchers to publish different forms of research outputs, however big or small. So we have your typical original research article, but also many other article types, like a research note, which can be for a single finding, things like method articles, data notes, protocols, software tools. These are all peer-reviewed. These can be of varying lengths. And the idea is that the researchers can disseminate their research as and when they're ready for it, rather than having to wait for lots of multiple parts of the research to come together to make a big paper, if so they want. Or they can come with their main original findings as a full research paper if they want to. So this is just to show you how the model works. So when the paper is published, it goes to an in-house editor. So all of the in-house editors are, like myself, ex-researchers. So what they're doing is they're looking for scope. We publish anything in life sciences, clinical research, health services research, also some elements of social sciences as well. And then the language, can it be understood? Does it need copy editing? We look quite strictly at reporting guidelines. Because we publish first, we want the article to be as clear as possible. So if it's an article that has used animals in the study, we check for adherence to ARRIVE guidelines. If it's a systematic review, PRISMA guidelines, and so on. So the in-house editor will actually check the manuscript against the relevant guideline and annotate it for the author if more reporting is needed according to those reporting guidelines. The editor's also checking for the data availability. So what they're doing is they're receiving the data set. We have a mandatory data sharing policy, receiving the data set and actually checking to see that it makes sense. Has it been coded properly? Have they provided the keys? Can anyone look at this data set independently of the article and know immediately what they're looking at? And we also check for any identifiable information. So if there's sensitive information in there, then we advise the authors on what to take out, or actually if they should make it available through a restricted access route rather than an open route. Ethics, according to the study design, consent as well. And as long as all that's okay, we also look at the reviewers that we ask the authors to suggest. So we're checking for things like, do they have any competing interests? Are they at the same institution? Were they ever married to the authors? And anything that, we can find. And as long as there's nothing to worry about, then they'll be invited. So once all that's set, the article is published immediately. It has a DOI. This can happen from about 7 days from submission, so it's available immediately. And that triggers the peer review process. So it's the in-house editorial staff that will be inviting the reviewers. So we also source the email addresses independently. So I'm sure many of you will have heard of things like fake peer review rings and that kind of thing. So what we do is we receive the reviewer names, check for conflicts of interest, and then we go off and find their email addresses ourselves. And if we can't find the email addresses independently, either on the home pages or articles that they've published, then we don't invite them. So the reviewers are asked to focus on methods and analysis and if the conclusions align with the data that has been presented. Basically, is the article scientifically valid? And if so, they provide their report and a recommendation, minor reservations approved or rejected. And the the report is published, and it receives, as I mentioned at the beginning, its own independent DOI. And as soon as it's published, the author can see it and the readers can see it at the same time. What's that? Oh, there you go. I don't know why that happened. So the idea is that the author's not having to wait for the editor to collect the reports and decide to send a decision to them. The author can actually see the report as and when it comes in. So we do have editorial staff moderating the reports as well, but they're usually fine. And once they're published, the author can communicate to us if they want to halt the peer review process or not, or if they want to continue. So we have had cases where an author will come back and say, actually, the points raised by reviewer 1 are quite important. If no one else is writing a report at the moment, can I revise this right now, come to you with a version 2? And then we say, that's fine. We stop inviting other reviewers. They come back with version 2, which sits on top of version 1. And then once that's done, we go back to the original reviewers and invite further reviewers. So that's what I meant by author-focused at the beginning, that the author has a say. And they can also say to us, no, I want to wait for the further review reports to come in. And as I said before, that we have a mandatory data sharing policy, so all articles have a data availability statement. So this brings us on to our relationship with the funders and in some institutions at the moment. So since our model started publishing over 5 years ago, we had discussions with the Wellcome Trust to begin with. And Wellcome Trust wanted to have a model like this available to anyone that they are funding. Why? Well, it's partly because a lot of what they're funding is not being published, it's not being reported. And I mean the smaller outputs and the data that's associated with it. So their motivation is that if we can provide a platform where anyone that we are funding can actually come there and actually submit, knowing that there's not going to be an editor there saying it's not important or we're not interested in null results and so on. And also the fact that the funder, in this case Wellcome Trust, will cover the article processing charge so the author doesn't have to worry about payment, then that should help to spread the dissemination of all the research that they are ultimately funding. So Wellcome Open Research launched in 2016, October, and then last year, in November, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation opened their own platform, same model, with us as well. So what I would stress here, their role here is they are making it available for anyone that has an active grant from them. They're not actually interfering in any editorial decisions or so on. It really is, as long as you've got an active grant from them, you can submit, we check for that, and then we carry on all the checks and the peer review process, as I just explained, for F1000 research. And earlier on this year, we also had the Montreal Neurological Institute, so here an institution with a very strong open science agenda, opening their own platform with us. Again, the same kind of sort of process in place. Anyone affiliated with M&I can submit there in any of those article types that I showed you before. So why are they interested? Well, it's because there is an overall demand for openly sharing the research that is being conducted, helping in the sort of the movement towards sharing data openly, not just data, but the materials and the software used as well, and ultimately to accelerate the impact of the research that they're all funding. And, when we ask, or if anyone asks them that, why are you interested in opening this open research platform, it's really just an additional service to the researchers that they have chosen to fund in the first place. So there's no mandate in place. They're not saying you have to publish in these platforms. It's really something, an alternative venue or to complement where the researchers can choose to submit their work. It's just if they submit to these platforms, they don't have to worry about the APCs or, like I said, anyone making a decision on impact. So just, I've got some numbers to show you how Wellcome Open Research is working because they were the first ones to publish with us. So far we've published around 220 articles from Wellcome Open Research. 64% of those have been research articles and 36% have been the other article types. Method articles and protocols are basically the next most popular on Wellcome Open Research. And does it work? Well, we saw that they have fairly impressive turnaround times. This data is current as of last Friday. So the peer reviewing times are, it takes about 15 days to receive the first review report from publication, 29 days to receive the second review report, and 37 days to be eligible to be indexed. There's been 601 review reports published so far, so this is associated with the 220-ish articles I just mentioned. So it's 601 because the reviewers are actually coming back and re-reviewing articles that have been revised and so on. And overall, 89 days to be indexed from the date it's been submitted. So that would include the back and forth with the editorial office if anything further has been required. So overall, we've had fairly good response from the researchers who are funded by Wellcome. Many of them have returned with further articles. And in a survey that was conducted earlier on in the year, Robert Kiley, who actually oversees the open access policies of Wellcome Trust, stated that the Wellcome Open Research is now the 5th most popular venue for anyone that they're funding to submit to. So there's been a fairly positive response. And really in a kind of, I guess, in a reaction to this, people saw that, it's working for Wellcome. They've had a positive response. Gates have opened ones. We've had further, this year we've had, I think altogether about 7 platforms, open research platforms launched or launching. So here I've got some quotes from some of the key people behind those platforms. So the top one is from Professor Rosalind Smith from UCL Great Ormond Street. So we're launching a platform with them in the next few months. And one of the things that she has honed into is that this is about making the work that they're funding reach the widest possible audience to maximize the impact of the work. Professor Nelson Torto from the African Academy of Sciences, I really like what he says here. He mentions it's about providing attributable peer review and enables African scholars to benefit from transparent intellectual interchange. He really liked the openness of the peer review process between authors and the reviewers. And Aisling, I hope I pronounced her name correctly, Aisling Bernan from AMRC. So this is a collection of 23 charities. We'll be launching with them later on in the year. She talks about the problems of having research put behind paywalls or never published at all. And so by providing this kind of platform, they're trying to encourage the researchers that they're publishing to actually be open to the idea of publishing these kind of outputs and having them openly peer-reviewed and published in such a transparent way that it gets disseminated quickly. And that brings me to the end, but I guess we're having questions right at the end. That's all from me. Thank you.
And finally, we're going to hear from Marianne Martin.
Okay. So I had figured that by the time I got up, a lot of the issues would be covered. So I decided that I would, and also with encouragement from Michelle, focus my comments as a view from a biomedical researcher. And I put biomedical in there. I, like Sabina, am a neuroscientist because I think biomedicine in particular has several unique issues, specifically in the way that it publishes and the amount that it publishes that require a special attention. So I think it's always important to remember why we publish. And primarily, we publish our information because we want to make our findings known. And we want them to be known so that they can be built upon, right? We know that that's the way science works. You constantly build on previous work. And if that work is unpublished or in your head and never communicated, then it does no good to anybody. And we want other scientists to use this, but increasingly, right, society, others, policy decisions are being made on top of the work that is being published. But also, we've heard this mentioned several times already, prestige, power, and money. I first heard the term prestige economy, that's what science was, I think from Alan Leshner from AAAS way back when, probably 20 or 30 years ago. But our reputation as scientists is established by not just what we publish, but where we publish in the exclusive journals, the single-name journals, and being able to get into those selective journals, as you saw in the survey, is considered a mark of quality. And I think that we know that this has distorted the scientific literature, that in fact the basic communication functions for a very long time became subordinate to the fact that we wanted to publish only in the best journals and the selective journals. And so where you published became a filter on what was actually allowed to get in to the scientific corpus. And that's, of course, we know has caused troubles because we have stopped thinking in many ways inside, especially the big competitive research universities, that our primary job, if we get money from funders, is to give an accounting of what we did with that money. And oftentimes the only place that that happens is in the final progress report that we've got to give to the funders, where, again, it's not useful. So there's been a large push, I think, for open access and other things and alternate forms of publication, as we've heard, so that the bar to recovering this information is not so high, and that we start to recognize that one of the reasons we are funded is to produce information and knowledge and make that available. And I don't know how many of you saw this recent piece on AI researchers and how the Nature was going to launch a new journal on AI, and a lot of the leading researchers said, no, we don't want you to do that. We don't want it to be distorted by this idea that there's this competitive closed access journal that we now have to get into that's going to limit access to the information, not just by other researchers, but there's a basic statement here that says locking up our research papers behind a paywall would make public scrutiny more difficult. We hear about AI every day. We hear about both its promise and also its perils, and these researchers want to make sure that the public also has access to this so that they can understand what's going on inside of a field. So I think that one of my main regrets as a researcher very early on, I have not regretted the things that I published, but I've regretted a lot the things that I haven't published because I never understood until relatively late in my career that it wasn't just about publishing my important things and the things that were worthy, but it was about publishing everything that I had done so that other people could build on top of it. And so all of the efforts in preprints and others are very welcome developments. So one of the themes here is what are the costs of open access? But I think one of the themes of my talks is going to be, well, what are the costs of unrecovered, of non-open access, of closed access, unrecovered research? You may have seen this from The Lancet a few years ago, and they estimated that there's unpublished dark data that nobody can get access to. It's in file drawers, never been published anywhere. And they said, yeah, it's about $240 billion. So there's a lot of money that's locked up in these file drawers in people's heads that can have no impact. And a lot of this is negative results replications. Again, the things that people think are not worthy to spend the time and effort to make sure that it can get out there, or that journals, as the arbiter of what is allowed to go in there, are not worthy of being published. One of the reasons I say that I'm also editor-in-chief of a journal is because I said, I understand from an editorial perspective. I get research all the time. Brain and Behavior is a sound science journal. But I look at it and I'm like, if I want to build a reputation in my journal, this is not the paper I want to publish. It's a replication. It's not interesting. But I do it anyway because, I believe that you have to practice what you preach and say, this is a place where this can actually get into the scientific literature. So as a funder, I can see why they very much, again, want to increase their return on investment. They paid for this research. They would like to see it deposited somewhere. The Chan Zuckerberg Institute was one of the major, or foundation, investors into bioRxiv, into the preprint servers, because they recognized, again, that this was one way for research that otherwise would not be published to get into the scientific literature, into the scientific corpora. And I was recently on a thesis committee where the student came back to defend his thesis. He'd moved on. He'd gotten a job someplace else in Silicon Valley. We knew he was never going to publish his research. We said, please put it in bioRxiv so at least somebody has access to it. That's very important. And I was very pleased to see that his thesis committee agreed. They said, yes, this is the way it's going. It has to have a public presence. It has to have some place where we can get access to it. So we see the rise of preprint servers across many different fields. Also, and this has been touched upon by the previous speakers, recognition for non-traditional scholarly outputs. In many ways, publishing data and code is where the funders have been for many, many years already. It is the funders, NIH and others, NSF, that are supporting the data repositories where the data that underlies scientific papers is deposited. And I consider them one of the ecosystem of publishers for the 21st century because they are making this data public in the very essence of the word publishing. So in many ways, I feel that funders have been in this game for a very long time already. And why? Because, again, they want this data to be available so that it can be reused. But a second reason also for putting it in is not just so that other people can use this. And I think that that was touched on in the innovative products in the morning quite a bit. The number of AI, full text access products that were out there was really starting to increase. And this, of course, the fourth paradigm came out way back when in the 90s by Jim Gray, but recognizing that science, like everything else, is really entering into a data-intensive period. And I liked this quote from Michael Nielsen in his book, Reinventing Discovery. An unaided human's ability to process large data sets is comparable to a dog's ability to do arithmetic and not much more valuable. We increasingly need to be assisted by computational tools, AI, whatever you want to call it, machine learning, to be able to digest and actually use what is in the scientific literature. So you may have seen something called the FAIR Guiding Principles for Scientific Data. I'm assuming most of you have heard of FAIR. These are high-level principles to make data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And the key thing is this is for both humans and machines. It emphasizes both human ability to find, access, and use this data, and machines to computationally access it through APIs and other types of activities. And most people recognize that it's really not just scientific data in the way that we might understand it in an Excel spreadsheet, but it's really all research outputs need to be amenable and available for this type of computational processing. And one can look at the literature, because most scientific data still occurs in the literature. That is where we talk about it as a big data set. And I want to focus on PubMed. PubMed lists about 28 million abstracts. It's not that easy to actually find out. NIH, recognizing that it needed to increase the access to its research, of course, launched PubMed Central. There's about 4 million articles in PubMed Central where humans can get full text access to it. But interestingly, only about 2 million of those, or half of those, are considered part of the open access subset, which means it has a liberal enough license that you are allowed to use it for text mining or natural language processing. So we are able to access computationally without too much difficulty, about 2 million of these 28 million articles. And why is that important in biomedicine? Well, the unit of a finding inside of a paper in biomedicine is extremely tiny relative to biomedical science as a whole. So you may have an entire paper on one small part of a pathway that, of course, is part of thousands of signaling molecules that are spread out over huge distances inside of organisms. So each thing is only meant to cover an extremely tiny fraction of what we know about a system. And if we can't put those together, if we cannot concatenate them together, we will never understand what's going on. And the reason why I think you see a lot of neuroscientists in this domain is neuroscience has had a horrible track record in having any impact on neurodegenerative, neurotraumatic, neuropsychiatric diseases. And I think one of the reasons is that this reductionist approach has not served neuroscience extremely well. There is nothing more integrated and networked than the brain. And to try to understand it in these small units is just impossible. And it is beyond any individual capacity to understand this. We have to have computational tools, which means we have to have computational access. So I think this 2 million papers is the most heavily mined scientific literature in the world, I suspect, but it's woefully incomplete compared to what we know. So again, I want to ask the question, not what are the costs of open access, but what are the costs of closed access? What is the cost of us not being able to easily get access to this? Well, the corpus is fractured. So when I first started in text mining, I said, oh, that's great. UCSD's library is fabulous. We have access to all these scientific papers. We're going to go ahead and mine them. And they said, oh, no, you're not, because the library signed a contract with the publishers that said you're not allowed to computationally access these papers. You can have a graduate student download them each one by one, crack the PDFs, and then do it, but we're not going to give you computational access. I said, well, that's stupid. That is not the way this is meant to work, right? Now, a lot of the publishers put up APIs, but they are not adequate for text mining, the ones that we're allowed to get. They don't give you access. You don't know what you've mined. You don't get fragments of the text, and I'm sorry, but that's not acceptable. And why is that so important? Even in a tiny field, Spinal muscular atrophy, where I started, where there were about 1,500 papers at the time that we started doing text mining. That was scattered across about 6 or 7 or 8 different publishers. No publisher owns the corpus on Alzheimer's. And increasingly we know that the answers to Alzheimer's may not be in Alzheimer's, but it may be in Parkinson's, or it may be in something else altogether. So this leads to a case where the corpus is fractured. What are the costs to society? And I know this is a little bit hard to read. This is, again, a personal story. I, like many of you probably in this room, are dealing with elderly relatives. You're dealing with people who are having trouble. And when we had an elderly relative who was in a nursing home, developed a problem. Of course, people come to me because I'm a scientist. I'm like, okay. I'm sending them all these papers. They're like, how come I have to pay $35 for this? How come I have to pay $39 for this? And I'm like, oops. Oh, yeah, I keep forgetting, right? I keep forgetting you don't have access to these things. So I have a choice. I can download the PDF and send them, or you're allowed to take the subset that's in PubMed Central. I tell them about PubMed Central. It's great that research shows up a year after it's published, but if your relative's in the nursing home and you have to make a life or death decision, you really don't like that. And I think that there's a conceit that the public at large, oh, well, they don't understand it. We're going to abstract it. We're going to write news stories. I myself as a scientist know that what's going on in those reporting sites is woefully inadequate compared to what's in the literature itself. And I think it's a conceit to say that people out there would not want access to this information. And finally, since everything is personal with me, there's a cost to researchers and institutions. So we've already seen that PubMed Central has to replicate what's already published someplace else. Okay? Now, there are reasons for that, having it centralized. Text mining is one of them. But I've noticed that at the University of California, we have our eScholarship repository. When I published in an open access journal, which I try to do as much as possible, I published my article. It's automatically deposited in PubMed Central, and UC eScholarship grabs that in, and everybody's happy. When I published in closed access, mostly this is automated in PubMed Central. I remember the early days where I had to go and actually manually upload my article, which was time and effort on my part. But now, I still, in our eScholarship, I have to upload a preprint, not the publisher's proofs, but a preprint, which means I have to go back, figure out what all the changes are, make those again, and upload them. And so we're basically having possibly 3 different versions of articles, 3 different publishing workflows, and nothing makes me angrier as a researcher than when my time is wasted on doing work over and over and over again, which could only be done once. So basically, those were the main points that I wanted to make, and I thank you for your attention.
Maybe I'll get things started. So, Will, you seem to be coming down on in looking at funder platforms. It seemed like you were intimating that from your analysis, they seem more like competitors than collaborators. And then Sabina, in your research, one of your points in talking was that one of the reasons for the platforms was to be able to publish a lot of things that weren't being published otherwise. But the data showed that, like 2/3 of the articles are research articles.
Yes.
So I just wondered, from everybody's point of view, sort of, or is there sort of any author behavior that you're seeing that points to how this is shaking out in terms of where people are deciding to publish and why?
Who do you want to go first?
Everybody.
I've got the mic, so I'll go
Yeah,
first.
but go ahead and start.
So if I take the funder platforms as an example to begin with, I think what we see typically is when the researchers are trying it out, they might first submit a protocol or a data note, something like that, to really get a sense of what the peer review process is like and what the speed is like. And then what we've seen is that after they've gone through that, then they've come back with a research article. And the research articles will be all types. It can be something fairly groundbreaking, but it can also be null findings, replication studies, and that's something that we really encourage them to publish, so that research article proportion would be a combination of all of those types of research articles. So what we see is that as we gain, trust, then they come back with more and more research articles.
So I think it's too early to tell. And on some level you can view that it is complementary because there are journals like Science that don't have the space to publish data articles or reports. But that doesn't mean in our other subscription journals we shouldn't be innovating and including broader research outputs. That's certainly something we should be doing. But I just want to make a point that there is, I think, a distinction between the rhetoric of stakeholders, of publishers and funders, and that is something wholly different and often completely detached from authors and researchers and their behavior. And one is in a political context, and the other one is going to be how do authors treat these publication platforms? Where does it fall into their workflow and their publication decisions? And it probably takes us a year or two to actually see how this ecosystem evolves.
Perhaps I could say something from UCL Press in terms of research monographs, which we publish, which are mainly in the arts and humanities, some social sciences, some science, but mainly arts and humanities. And I think there is something significant about author behaviour, which I've noticed over the 3 years we've been in existence. So 3 years ago, when I established the press, I had consultation meetings with heads of department, with researchers, and with deans of faculty in my institution. And I said, I understand you've got some issues around your ability to publish and the current publishing model. Please tell me what I can do with an institutional open access press. What can I do to help you overcome some of those barriers which you say you're experiencing? 3 years ago, most of the responses were, we don't want to publish a research monograph in arts and humanities in open access because we don't understand what open access is, we don't like it, we'd much rather publish with a commercial publishing model, even though the number of sales from a commercial publishing activity on the whole are actually quite small. Well, 3 years on, they're not saying that now. Why aren't they saying that now? They're not saying that now because they see the download figures that these individual monographs are getting from UCL Press. And it's not just UCL Press. Any institutional open access publisher that's following our open access monograph model would probably have the same set of results. We have a publishing list with proposals that we're now taking proposals 2 years ahead of publishing because there are so many proposals coming in from our authors who want to publish with us. Why do they want to publish with us? Because of the download figures, because of the impact, because in the REF, our research evaluation exercise, open access impact can be part of the environment statement that you submit as an institution, and you get extra credit, recognition, and extra funding if you make a very good case in that environment statement for the impact that open access has made. So all these things, the platform, the publishing model, and the political environment are all changing the culture and the way that authors behave. So what started 3 years ago as, I'll do this over my dead body, now means we have more than enough monographs to keep going for the next couple of years. And it's a nice problem to have because we have too many things that we need to publish rather than too few.
So I agree with Will, and when I tend to be critical of our current publishing, I actually mostly am critical of the researchers themselves because it's the researchers who drive all this. They don't know they drive it, and that's the interesting thing. The number of times they tell me it's like, well, I can't make that available because the publisher then won't, and I'm like, I'm sorry. First of all, most of that's not true. Like, I can't put my data out in a public repository because then the publisher or the editor or whatever is not going to let me. And I said, but that this attitude got in there is just very telling, right? But it's not anything, for those of you, who ride horses, it's often amazing to us how much they listen to us considering how much stronger they are than we are. And we're always afraid one day they're going to figure that out, right? Because we're like, well, actually, they could beat us to a pulp if they wanted to. But so it seems to be this sort of psychological grip. And so really those of us who are trying to change all of this are now going after promotion and tenure and other types of things that said, where did these ideas start to come in? And why do they have such a grip on the way that we view publishing? I think in these sort of circles, Force 11 and others, this idea that one should be publishing everything, and a subset of those may end up in exclusive journals as a mark of recognition, but that everything is out there and inaccessible in some way is going to start to take hold, and that's why I think so many people are very excited about preprint. Everybody had to look at their own incentive structures, right? NIH had to say, well, you can put it in a preprint, but we're not going to let you refer to this in a grant, right? So again, a lot of these things were really imposed by the researchers themselves and their evaluation committees, and I think that takes a while to dislodge, but I think it's starting to dislodge.
Hi, I'm Nina Hoffman from ASH. I'm wondering if, as funders become publishers and have platforms, it is widely believed by authors that the impact factor, especially in Europe and Asia, is very important to the tenure and promotion of authors. So given that funders don't really have an impact factor, or will they, do you see a shift in the promotions of people in the European Union and Asia, and how will the impact factor be factored into funders that are publishers?
Okay, I'd like to start the answer to that. Okay, I can only talk about Europe. I can't talk about Asia or other parts of the world, I'm afraid, but I can talk about Europe. So I'll come back to LERU, the League of European Research Universities. 23 research-intensive universities in Europe. We have signed the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment, which says that the journal impact factor cannot be used as a surrogate for the quality of an individual article. It says nothing, absolutely nothing, about individual articles, and you can't reduce quality to a numerical value. How is that taken forward in LERU? Well, in my institution, I steered through with, that's not true, our Vice Provost Education steered through a new academic promotions framework last year, and I contributed to that because I lead for open science in my institution, and we reward openness as a core criterion for promotion through the grades to the professorial grade. We do not recommend that journal impact factors are used in promotion or appraisal frameworks. And we're just about to go out to consultation with our new bibliometrics policy for the university. It's taken me 2 years to get a working group of academic support staff and academics to agree the principles of the bibliometrics policy. But the bibliometrics policy repeats what we say in the academic promotions framework, that journal impact factors should not be used. It is not accepted that they're used as criteria for promotion, because they do not measure anything at the article level. So in Europe, there is, I'm not saying that all academic colleagues are signed up to the San Francisco Declaration, because there is a great deal of discussion about how you operationalize the declaration at an institutional level. But in Europe, there is a growing debate about how you take the San Francisco Declaration forward and operationalize that so that you're delivering open science practices in your institution. And promotion frameworks and bibliometric policies are one way that we're trying to do that.
So it's very encouraging to hear that from you, Paul, actually. I mean, so one of the reasons we have the model the way that we do, the F1000 research model, is to work against the impact factor. Now, personally, my dream is that impact factors will die in my lifetime. Now, I don't know if that will happen, but the way it skews what ultimately gets published, and, it skews editors' decisions whether or not they like it, it skews journal goals whether or not they like it, it's very, very bad for science. So this is why with the F1000 research model, it being open and versioning and, all of this, it's really about the article level, the researcher level, not the platform level. And that's why it was very important for us to talk to the funders and the institutions, because the feedback we get from researchers is, well, I love the idea, but if I'm going to get promoted, then my institution's going to be looking at the impact factor of the journals I'm publishing in. Or some of them are even told that they cannot submit to a journal of impact factor lower than X, So that was precisely why we had to take this to the funders and the institutions and say that, would you actually support the open publishing and support your researchers to publish all types of outputs, however small or null or confirmatory. If you would support that and also support the fact that we don't have an impact factor, we don't want an impact factor, we never will go for an impact factor, as last time I heard anyway, then if they're the ones telling the people that they're funding or hiring that we're not going to look at impact factors, then it will go away. I mean, that's where the incentive comes from. The other one is, okay, if we don't talk about impact factors, if we're talking about things like reputation. So a key thing is where I publish, I want to make sure that people will respect my work. They'll respect the vetting process or, how it got in there. So obviously these are new platforms. As I mentioned, F1000 Research is just over 5 years old. But our argument is everything is open. You can see for yourselves. You don't have to take our word for it that, we've tried to select the best referees for this. And actually, we welcome readers' comments. We have sometimes readers coming in and commenting on the reviewer, and there have been a couple of cases where we've had, as a result, gone off and got further reviewers. So the idea is that if you can keep it completely open, not focus on the impact factor, focus on the article at its own level, and come up with better ways of measuring the impact of the article, whether it's things like downloads, views, or Mendeley saves, or what have you. We also have F1000 Prime, which is a recommendation service, and what that does, it picks some of the top articles in its field and will recommend that to fellow researchers, which is another type of metric, So this is really where things are moving, and which I think will help us steer away from, the impact factor billboard.
Mm-hmm. I know there's another question, so I'll just have one quick comment. I've often reminisced with my older colleagues where I said, I don't even remember when exactly this started to come in, because when I started in research in the 80s and 90s, we never talked about any of this. And we understood that there were journals that represented our field, and that if you could get one in, you could get an article into it, that was a good measure that this was considered novel or particularly complete. But when we use the word high impact, we just use that to mean things that we knew in our field published high-quality articles. And we didn't really care that there was a number associated with it. So I don't know whether it's the internet that now lets you look up numbers, or the broadening out of biomedical science, or what the heck it is. But I do remember a time when we never discussed any of that in our promotion and tenure decisions.
Yeah. So, Brooks Antoniciu. Marianne, I agree with a lot of what you said, but I'd like to push back from a couple examples that I know on a couple areas, particularly regarding the text mining via a central government repository. So we've actually worked with people in our community in geosciences. So if you want to understand the sedimentation history of the Earth over 4 billion years, you need to mine basically all of the geologic literature to look at time-space micro measurements, same sort of thing. So we've been happy to work with our researchers on enabling that, and the logical place to enable that was at the institutional library repositories. And in fact, when I approached Wiley, they said, oh, we'll give them not just the AGU content, but all of Wiley content for this research. So my experience has been a little bit different in terms of that, and I appreciate the value of a central government repository. I'll just remind everyone that we worked with our community in 2017 to rescue climate data from U.S. government repositories, because the change in government led to a situation where the new government was not caring for that science. I'm being as polite as I can. So having, it seems, there are various ways of doing that, and I think the community is, there's an advantage to a distributed system as well, and having that system not connected with a government, from our experience. So just a couple thoughts.
No, so there's no disagreement there. I mean, I think that there's always an argument about distributed versus centralized, and I view our institutions should be the places that are giving us access to this, and that the agreements they put together with the publishers should allow that. And whether it's institution by institution, to me, this is where it has to go. And I really don't care how I get access to it, as long as it doesn't take me months and months and months and months of negotiation to try to get it. And then the next instance, I got to do it over again, and I can't invite my colleague in to help me, right? So those are the trade-offs, I think.
Perhaps I could just say something very quickly about text and data mining. Current issues in Europe about text and data mining. So the European Commission in Brussels is being lobbied, and has been lobbied for about 8 years now, by researchers and by libraries, people like me, for a mandatory exception in European copyright laws to allow text and data mining by anyone who has legal access to the content. Because many publisher licenses don't allow text and data mining in Europe at the moment. In the UK, our framework does, but only for academic purposes. That's not very open science, because you're ignoring citizen science, you're ignoring researchers who are not affiliated with academic institutions. And our contention, those of us who are supporters of open science, believe that these barriers have got to be broken down. And that another way you operationalize open science type activity is by looking at your legal and licensing frameworks and making them compatible with open science approaches, which allow text and data. We're not asking for access to content we have no legal access to. What we are saying is that it should be mandatory and not overridable by a contract or automatic prevention, digital prevention measures to allow text and data mining by anyone who has legal access to the content. It's taken us 8 years through the discussions in Brussels with the Commission to try and get agreement between all the stakeholders. We still don't have agreement because different parties want different things. Some people like me want to be very open. Others want to be more restrictive. So there isn't agreement. But unless we can push back on licensing and copyright restraints, we're not going to be able to deliver open science approaches. And I'd be really interested to hear how that works out in North America, what your challenges are about getting to that position where everyone can text and data mine if they want to, regardless of what institution they're attached to.
We've got a question from the online audience as well.
Excellent.
All right. It's from Duke University Press. For any or all of the panelists, has the international attention on data security and associated efforts and initiatives to prevent mishandling of data, personal or otherwise, such as GDPR, prompted any rethinking of workflows, platform design, screening protocols, e.g., F1000 searching online for conflicts of interest, who's married to whom, ?
Can I? Well, I'll start. So, I mean, in terms of the who's married to whom, that's not something we're publishing. That's something that we're just searching for. If sometimes you have people put their photos up together, it's rare. I just put that in the middle to wake people up. You know, it always gets a laugh when I mention that. So that's I was sort of joking, but I was serious. Basically, we would look up a potential reviewer's name. What do I mean by that? Nothing special. Pop their name into Google, and we're just looking at things like what kind of activities do they have? Do they have a homepage that lists this as their research interest? And sometimes you get some other kind of news about them that's out there in the media. Regarding data security, I'll kind of focus that on the data sets that are associated with the research articles. So any of the data that's being shared has to be shared in a public open repository. The authors have to choose either a CC0 or CC BY license. And one of the things that we're checking for, I mean, the editorial team, is whether there's any sensitive information in there. So even though we ask authors not to include sensitive information, sometimes they do. So we do take that step, and there have been cases where we've advised them to take something down that they've put up on another repository. But other than that, I think data security is an ongoing concern for everyone, and we're all learning as we go as well, but I guess we do our best to keep it secure. Who wants to go next?
Hi. Just thinking about rigorous peer review and that being crucial for article quality, journal quality, I guess specifically for F1000, but welcome all comments. Is there a danger to putting up articles that haven't completely gone through this peer review process and seeing the various stages, also considering that it may not be subject experts who are assigning these peer reviewers?
That's a good question. I always get that question. So in terms of the stringency of the peer review, so the way that the experts are identified, so in the first instance we ask the authors to suggest them, and then we also look at, do they cover all aspects of the paper as far as we can tell. We also ask the reviewers to declare their speciality and also to declare. So in the report we have a free form where they can give their comments, but then there's some mandatory questions in the hope that we can prompt them to think if they can cover all aspects of the article. So there are specific questions, mandatory, that they have to answer that get published alongside the report. Part of that is, did you look at the stats? For example, has the data been made available? Are the methods appropriate for this study? So we're prompting them to actually think about those questions specifically. And then if the reviewer comes back and actually says, no, I haven't been able to look at the stats, then we can go off and find a particular statistical reviewer. We do have an advisory board as well, so that they would be subject experts, active researchers in the field who agree to advise us on particular articles. So if there are problems, we can actually go to them and say, can you have a look at this particular paper, either to review it or to advise on if there's an impasse between the author and the reviewer. But that's in terms of the danger of having it online before it's been reviewed. I guess it's the same arguments that are put forward for preprints. The idea is that if it's a scientific piece of information, it's a scholarly piece of work and it's out there and it doesn't contain anything sensitive. Now, I quite like, yes, I think Jorg is still in the room from +1. Hi. So he pointed out something yesterday I quite liked, which is we still would actually focus on how much information is too much information. So I think you mentioned something about identifying the location of endangered species or that kind of thing. So we'd still be looking for those kind of things, and you don't need to necessarily be an absolute subject expert for that. You need to have scientific knowledge and to see that actually this particular piece of research could be sensitive, and we need to be aware of that and careful of that. So that's sort of the editorial checks that we do. But so far we haven't had any particular problems in terms of having it out there. If an article doesn't pass peer review, everyone can see it, and they can see why.
So unfortunately we're out of time, but thank you all for coming, and a big round of applause for our speakers.